Europeans held a worldview very different from that of indigenous peoples. It was founded in Christian beliefs and the idea that one supreme being gave them the right to colonize and civilize Newfoundland. This supremacy conception bolstered the belief in a hierarchy of races and civilizations. At the top of this perceived hierarchy were Christian Europeans. Early settlers and their descendants believed that the only way that others could enjoy the rights of men was through European conquest. The purpose of European conquest was to establish colonies for economic exploitation of human and natural resources. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald had an expansionist dream of colonizing across the prairies and through the Rocky Mountains. It needed to happen faster than that taken to colonize the East. The one thing blocking him from access to all those resources were the indigenous nations already forced from their lands to reservations. He needed some way to break their cultural identity and replace it with one which cohered with the European industrial mindset. The best method was education. A report he commissioned on industrial schools in the United States showed that residential schools were best practice for cultural coercion. Industrial schools were a global trend to control the industrializing world's dangerous classes and to rescue unemployable children growing up in poverty. They were not just used on indigenous people. Ryerson believed that education ought to develop the essence of the self. He posited an education through engaging instruction by masterful educators with an intimate knowledge of their subjects and the ability to relate those subjects to the lives of any one of their students. He also thought that educators should use emotional connections with their students to build relationships of trust and so reduce any need for punitive measures in the process of convincing students to behave as expected. Ryerson was also the lead designer of the residential schools in Canada, which sought to eradicate Indigenous culture by breaking the connections of children to their ancestral roots. For Ryerson and educational leaders after him, making or breaking connections meant crafting compliance. The selves that Ryerson envisioned schools preparing were to be ready for their appropriate duties and employments of life as Christians, as persons of business, and also as members of the civil community in which they lived. In this way, education would create social subjects who enjoyed and actively embraced their social subordination, who experienced subordination as equality and liberty. This was Ryerson's philosophy of education for all children, not just Indigenous students. In the public school system Ryerson designed, the most important thing was that children learned to read, write, and calculate. But these skills needed appropriate context. Reading material needed to teach the kinds of ideas the society wanted. Christian values, the acceptance of social authority, and the willingness to play a part in the social machine. Ryerson decided that a curriculum limited to farm labor for boys and housework for girls and no other trade was the best for Indigenous students because there was not likely to be much demand for Aboriginal tradesmen.
Initially, some Indigenous parents thought their children ought to get an education. They knew that their world was changing, and it was best to have the knowledge of the settlers. When they learned that their children had to do long hours of manual labor with little or no developmental learning, they withdrew them. This was before legislation was introduced entitling the government to take children without parental consent. The training in manual labor was simultaneously implemented with the forced subservience to the hierarchical structures imported from the dominating culture. I use dominating here because the indigenous peoples of North America already had a dominant culture which the process of colonization was deliberately trying to obliterate.
The people in power at residential schools viewed their charges as something less than human. The belief that one supreme being commanded them to change everything to their way of living and thinking exacerbated the potential for abuse. We know from studies such as the Milgram experiment and the Stanford prison experiment that if you institute the license for monstrosity, people will become the monsters you ask them to be, or such a system will attract people prone to monstrous behavior. The educators in charge of residential schools in Canada were told by the government to take the Indian out of the child. This meant attacking their very identities, which gave license for all kinds of abuse.
The cultural context for which Ryerson designed education was alien to Indigenous culture. The goal, though, was to prepare students for the lives they were expected to lead in society. The racism embedded deep in the beliefs and social structures of colonizers saw no meaningful role for Indigenous peoples in their society, except as resources in service to that society. They did not care if they lived or they died. Many children did not survive residential schools. The schools designed for white European descendants also prepared them for the lives they were expected to lead. They had the same systemic purpose. The lives of the settler children mattered more to the government, but they also expected them to grow up and follow the rules, to become contributing members within expectations socially defined as their appropriate duties and employments of life as Christians, as persons of business, and also as compliant members of the social community in which they lived. Over time, social expectations changed, as did the awareness of learning needs and human development, but the structure of education to fulfill social expectation remains in place. How this is accomplished may appear different and may not be so subservient to a religious monopoly in contemporary education, but the objective remains reproducing the dominant cultural construct. The decision made by Prime Minister Macdonald to use education as a weapon against the cultural identity of Indigenous people emphasizes the systemic purpose of education. Macdonald wanted to replace the developmental identity of children with the desired social identity, which would support and reproduce the desired dominant cultural identity. Keep in mind that the dominant cultural identity is not always the most prevalent. In the context of colonization, the dominant culture was the one controlled by those with the most access to power, specifically the technology to physically force their social agenda. Education was seen as the best weapon against identity because it is systemically designed to influence the identity development of children. Systems of education rising from the Industrial Revolution employed employed coercive structures now endemic to education, and so embedded in the systemic practice that they are seldom questioned. Ryerson understood the essential structures well: external assessment of student affect, worth, and value to society, a curriculum which taught desired beliefs and discouraged undesired exploration, and a rigorous routine controlling time and expectation management. Cultural identity presented to Indigenous peoples in Canada was not something that they desired. It meant giving up everything that they were. They were against education, but they wanted to learn. This did not sit well with the government at the time because they wanted access to Indigenous lands, in addition to the ones already taken. And so they resorted to force. They forced children to be educated because education was the most effective method to influence identity development. It was effective because it could be controlled with a few simple structures, which people already used in the process of interacting with others. It was effective because it used the process of learning at the heart of identity formation. Education structured the process of learning economically to achieve the desired result, enhanced by the sense of success that completing the program as expected reinforced. Other social structures, such as the expectation of education to find gainful employment, made education a fruitful enterprise.